Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is a crossover with my Hudson Institute podcast, Arsenal of Democracy. I'm speaking with Raj Shah. He is a managing partner at Shield Capital and the co-author of a new book, Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are Transforming the Future of War. In this conversation, we cover everything from his time as the former director of the Defense Innovation Unit to the future challenges exposed by the war in Ukraine and this emerging state of conflicts in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. If you enjoy these defense and foreign policy related topics, I highly recommend you check out my Hudson Institute work. You can find all the links in the show notes to delve deeper into the tech area, especially. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
For today's episode, I'm joined by former Defense Innovation Unit Director Raj Shah to discuss his new book, Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are Transforming the Future of War.
No one is arguing that we need no aircraft carriers and they don't play an important role. They do. But does it have to be to the exclusion of what drones can do, both in the sea and on land? Do you need 12 aircraft carriers or do we need 11? Right? And how many drones can you buy for one less, or do you delay one? In Ukraine, we sent 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks, our main U.S. allied battle tank, probably the best in the world. And 25% of them were disabled by Russian kamikaze drones, and they had to withdraw the whole tank set away from the front lines. So is our, multi-decade, nearly a century of mechanized warfare coming under risk? How do we respond to that? It's not, just boiling it down to some trope, Silicon Valley good, defense bad, right? Like that just is not the right answer. It's going to take both perspectives and both approaches to come together and partner to ensure that our men and women in uniform never have to fight a fair fight.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Raj Shah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Marshall. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you. So based on previous guest appearances and topics the show has covered, I'm sure the audience is going to be well aware of different DoD, Pentagon innovation efforts. In-Q-Tel, that's the CIA, but it's related, obviously. Army Futures Command, I'm based in Austin. Of course, DARPA, you were a pivotal person in the sort of refounding of the Defense Innovation Unit. Can you place the DIU within this broader pantheon of military-focused innovation efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. Well, I think you have to think back to when the Defense Innovation Unit, experimental at the time, was being set up. Ash Carter, then Secretary of Defense, came out to the Valley in, I guess it would have been end of 2016, as the first sitting Secretary of Defense in 20 years to visit. This was just after the Snowden revelations. So there was an immense amount of mistrust between technology companies in the Valley and the national security apparatus on the East Coast. They didn't trust each other. Furthermore, it was so hard to do business with the government that venture investors would advise their companies not to work with the government. In fact, my very first startup was a cybersecurity company. Many of my early engineers were from the NSA. And we knew what we were building was valuable for government, but it was just so hard that our investors advised us not to do it, and we had no government revenue when we exited the business. So I think among that backdrop, you have to think, boy, these two worlds were really, really apart. And this was the first really sustained effort on part of the DoD to say, how do we mend those bridges, both from a contractual standpoint and from just like a human capital standpoint? And we had an amazing team. We could talk about some of the stories. And now I'm just so glad that there are many of these other organizations. In-Q-Tel was the first, but they were a little bit different. They were part of the intelligence community, and so they had a little bit maybe less restrictions than the Department of Defense had.
I'd like to talk about a tension that comes through when we talk about or explain defense tech to both LPs, investors, companies, et cetera, which is oftentimes we talk about how, look at the aircraft carrier. It's an exquisite system, like you just referenced. Christian Bros, former podcast guest, has always talked about this as well, too. You look at this $15 billion aircraft carrier that is hypothetically vulnerable to hypersonic missiles or other forms of attack from cheaper land-based systems. We then look at, by contrast, the drone. With a drone, it's cheaper, you could produce more of them, and most importantly, we could lose them without the same catastrophic amount of loss. All that said, though, an aircraft carrier can do something that a drone can't do, which is you could place an aircraft carrier near Israel post 10/7, and then it could deter Iran from intervening. It could deter Hezbollah from intervening. So there's a broader strategic picture than just this pure question of how much does something cost, how innovative is it, et cetera. That's typically a frustration that I have when we talk about these things. So I'd love to hear you just sort of reflect on that dynamic, because I think it's a weakness of the shorthand of only thinking through these systems through the lens of innovation, tech, and cost.
It's a great point, Marshall. I don't think it's a either or type of scenario. I think no one is arguing that we need no aircraft carriers and they don't play an important role. They do, right? They force project. They can go off the coast. There's lots of things outside of a South China Sea type of scenario that an aircraft carrier is really, really important. But does it have to be to the exclusion of facing reality of what drones can do, both in the sea and on land? And I think, do we need 12 aircraft carriers or do we need 11? Right? And how many drones can you buy for one less, or do you delay one? And I think we have to recognize that we are seeing some changes in epic changes in how warfare may be fought. So in Ukraine, we sent 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks, our main U.S. allied battle tank, probably the best in the world. And 25% of them were disabled by Russian kamikaze drones, and they had to withdraw the whole tank set away from the front lines. So is our, multi-decade, nearly a century of mechanized warfare coming under risk? How do we respond to that? And so I think these are really, really complex kinds of questions, and I appreciate that it's not just boiling it down to some trope, Silicon Valley good, defense bad, right? Like that just is not the right answer. It's going to take both perspectives and both approaches to come together and partner to ensure that our men and women in uniform never have to fight a fair fight.
And one of the reasons I was so excited to speak with you is you are someone who has served in the U.S. military, in the Air Force as an F-16 pilot. You've worked at the DoD, you've worked as a startup founder, and you are currently a VC. So usually I only talk to people in the defense space who do one of these things, but you do all four of these things. So I could ask you this question broadly. The key takeaway from your last answer was we need to do multiple things at once. We need to worry about our ability to produce aircraft carriers. We also need to think about the future. Has there ever been a time, you think, where we successfully balanced the present and the future? Because, you fought in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when you read about 2006, 2007 especially, and when Robert Gates came in as the new DoD secretary, some of the fights he was having were over, okay, we have this counterinsurgency problem, but actually the DoD wanted to focus on great power conflict. So even 15 years ago, we're just perpetually having this debate over the present versus the future. Now it's just sort of changed a bit in terms of like who's starring in the roles and what are the specific actors in mind. But I'd like to get your advice on how we should think about the present versus future when everything feels so pressing.
Yeah. Look, change is hard, Marshall. And whenever you are going from one paradigm to another, it's difficult. This is not a new problem. When the Air Force back in the 20s and 30s was supposing that aircraft could sink ships, it was very controversial. And the individual that solved that and showed that to the world, General Billy Mitchell, was ultimately court-martialed. And so these changes are not easy, but there are heroes, right? There are individuals that can make a difference. And I think what we were lucky to see at DIU or DIUX at the time, were several individuals that did just amazing work and changed how the department thought about stuff. And if we have time, I'll share a few of those stories. But I think if you look back historically to the Cold War, what Bill Perry and Augustine and others did. If you look at even World War II, when Knudsen and Kaiser mobilized what we now call the arsenal of democracy, individuals can make a difference.
Something I'm curious about, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, is obviously what's awkward about our present moment from a mental model perspective is it feels like we're in 1918. We could pick different historical examples, but 1918 feels apt because on the one hand, you have all of these technological innovations that clearly presage a future. You have the debut of the tank in the battlefield. You obviously have early air forces, but at the same time, what really mattered, especially in 19, was the German ability to move troops from the Eastern Front over to the West, and for finally, crucially, the Americans to enter the war quicker than anyone thought they were able to. I think in many ways, the same thing is true with the Russia-Ukraine war. We could obviously talk about swarms of drones. We could talk about artificial intelligence. We could talk about space. But the Russian ability just to produce artillery shells and just send men into the meat grinder has just been very, very critical. So we have both of these worlds at once. How do you think through that awkward bit of that dynamic?
Yeah, Marshall, I think what you point out, particularly in a lot of those things, is it's not any one technology that really turns the tide, but how it gets used and operationalized. So, in my view, I think the force or the group of allies that have the ability to most quickly understand, ingest, and operationalize a new technology are going to be the ones that prevail. So, last fall, I had an opportunity to go visit Ukraine, visit a few of our drone factories, and even got to go visit one of their electronic warfare test ranges where they had a bunch of Russian jammers and systems, and Ukrainian forces were testing out their drones. They would fly them. Some of them would get jammed and they wouldn't work, and they'd land them. And then some guys would get on the computer, write some new code, and send it up again. And so the cycle time here of responding to this change, right, the OODA loop, was hours or days. Certainly not months or years as the traditional systems were. So I think the pace of technologies has just continued to accelerate, and we have to have some new paradigms of understanding, okay, who are the right people to understand that quickly? What are the trade-offs for costs? What are the trade-offs for reliability in this new world? And so I think those are some of the types of changes that need to happen.
I'd love to hear you talk a little more about drones, because that is one of the DIU stories that really mattered. Because even in the 2010s, it was clear that the Chinese had severely outpaced the American commercial drone industry, even though that was a technology and an industry that actually came about here. In this case, much like with semiconductors, with semiconductors, however, this wasn't with an ally, it's actually with the adversary in this case. So talk about what the situation was in the 2010s and then how the DIU started thinking about addressing the issue.
So there was an Air Force officer, Colonel Mark Jacobson, who was, I think, finishing up his Stanford PhD. And he came over to DIUX at the time and helped set up something that we named the Rogue Squadron. And their job—
You guys love your Star Wars references, by the way.
Gotta love it, right? He was charged with, one, understanding how do we respond to the fact that at this point it's the Middle East, enemy combatants are using commercial drones. So how do we respond to that from a red standpoint? And then also, how do we provide this capability to blue forces? And as you aptly described, there's really no commercial drone manufacturers remaining, right? At least not on the consumer standpoint. DJI has basically taken the market. And they did some amazing things. Some of the things that we were able to talk about in the book, which was our troops out there would pick up enemy drones on the battlefield, some that had grenades attached to them or formerly had grenades attached to them. And they want to know, where did it come from? Where are the bad guys? And the process to date was you can take the memory chip and you can put it in a mail package and it gets flown back to some lab in the US and maybe somebody analyzes it and tells you, like, that doesn't work. So these guys invented a way where they could plug in directly with a mobile device into the drone and know where it came from, and then go out and try to eliminate that threat. They also developed software that was able to take foreign-made drones and ensure that it didn't send home any location information. So these are types of innovative things where literally it's five guys and gals in a cold warehouse on Moffett Field in Mountain View that are building this stuff. And so again, small groups can do amazing things. And now that program has, my successors, Mike Brown and Doug Beck, have taken that and done this large Blue UAS program and now Replicator to really scale it to a whole nother level.
Something I'm curious about, one of the big Trump and Biden era debates has been over industrial policy. And obviously, especially when it comes to things like semiconductors or things that are in the more domestic lens, manufacturing, et cetera, I think it's easy to just sort of debate that politically. But when it comes to, let's say, the creation of drones, my reaction to reading the story in the book was basically, look, let's just pass a CHIPS Act for drones. Who cares if it doesn't make any money? We just need to actually have this industry. And that's not an academic reaction. That was just sort of my initial reaction. How does just seeing the reality of the dual use nature of these technologies help shape how you think of our economic response to whether or not industry could function in this country?
Industrial policy, as you rightly say, has become a thing to be avoided, and I think that's finally changing to say we need a level playing field. I think when you think about drones, AI, which is really what underpins them, you have to think about it a little bit differently than artillery, which is only a military use. We should invest in whatever plants we need, and it's very much a governmental led effort, and let's make sure we have enough artillery. In these commercial things where you have a large consumer market, I think we have to be a little bit more careful in thinking about how do we harness all the other investment that companies and investors are making to go after this big commercial opportunity, and how do we then take that advancement and properly employ it for national security reasons, because the markets are just so much bigger that the government will never buy enough iPhones to support the development of it. But we are leveraging the fact that they're selling hundreds of millions of those phones a year, and we benefit from that rapid advancement.
Something I'm also curious about is the role of venture capital specifically in defense and innovation-focused areas, especially the parts of the typical, let's say, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s startup playbook that import well into defense tech and those that actually don't. Because, for example, as you no doubt know, a lot of the way that you could explain VC to a bunch of folks is sort of like you're playing baseball. Sometimes you're going to strike, sometimes you're going to make it to first base, but you really want the home runs to power it through. And it's okay if you only make one home run out of 10, because that's really what powers and returns the fund. However, when it comes to national security, obviously, a 1 out of 10 success rate doesn't really seem to be quite it. So how do you think through ways that you could import the Silicon Valley sort of mental model to defense and national security related areas?
Yeah, I think the model is you bet on your winners and you iterate very, very quickly, and hopefully the failures happen before you've made really large investments. But you're right, it follows a power law. Why? Because you're inventing something new. You're taking high risk, technology risk, market risk, and sometimes they don't pan out. But you catch them fast enough and early enough that the successes more than make up for it. And so I think that does actually port well into the defense world. That doesn't mean when you hop into a plane and take off, 9 out of 10 don't make it. Like that's not what we mean. But if you started with 10 companies very, very early, and the government customer was demanding with really high performance requirements, and then you tranche it along the way, and some of them don't make it, that's okay. But you're moving really, really fast, and I think speed in and of itself is important.
And this actually gets back to the story specifically because I'm fascinated to hear what it means for the government to be a good customer here. Because critically, with defense, unlike with most of these other categories you think about when you're talking about Silicon Valley, the prime customer is going to be the U.S. government. And I think very early on in your tenure at the DIU, a humongous issue was that the government was a horrible customer. So there was actually a startup where you had to basically write them a note from the principal saying, hey, these founders are great. This company is great. There's this broader issue we can't get into, which is impacting their ability to bring in revenue. So on the one hand, I could say to myself, well, this startup is just not really working. I'm going to VC, I'm going to write it off. But that wasn't what was happening at all. So like, what are the best practices for government in good faith, serving as a good customer that could enable us to use the iterate quickly and measure framework?
So Marshall, I think part of it is speed, and the other part is certainty. So let's talk about the speed portion. When the week that myself, Chris, and a few others were put in charge of DIU, we went around and met the team. And one of the people we met was a young woman named Lauren Daly. Lauren was the daughter of a tank commander, and her way of serving was to be an Army acquisition civilian. And when we met her on the first time, she said, hey, I think I found something in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act that I was reading. There was a clause, I think it was Section 815, that would allow us to move faster. We're like, that's pretty interesting. I mean, not a lot of people read that thing. It's like a big encyclopedia-sized text of boringness. But we're like, okay, well, great. Why don't you research it and tell us more about it? She's like, well, I happen to have written a 20-page paper on how to do it. Then hands it over. We're like, this is fantastic. So her and Chris got on a plane 2 days later. They go to the Pentagon. They meet the head acquisition lawyer. They met the general counsel of the Pentagon and basically got them to agree. Secretary Carter signed off, and she created a special type of other transaction authority called a commercial solutions opening, but basically bypasses the FAR, which we could do contracts in 60 days instead of the typical 18 to 36 months. And the good news now is since she put that together, the department has put over $70 billion worth of acquisitions through it. It's amazing. So one person. So I think speed is a piece of it. And really now it's not a legal issue. It's more like an incentives issue, right? Do you support and lionize folks that move quickly versus folks that move slowly? And the other part is certainty. I think part of the challenge for people in the Valley or sometimes startups, which I think is getting better, is sometimes you'll meet a very senior person from the Pentagon. A startup founder will meet a 4-star general who was going through the Valley, and she would say, hey, I really like this. This would really solve my problem. And they're sincere about it. I'd love to see it. But that startup founder is like, wow, this is a 4-star general who loves my stuff. I'm going to get a contract. This is great. Like, they're very powerful people, but they don't realize like budget and authority and contracting ability all may not lie with that person. And so that doesn't feel certain. You feel led on. And so I think the certainty piece of it is also getting better.
A certain degree of this isn't quite a fan question, but it's a very important question that I'm curious about. I'm curious what problems that you see facing the Pentagon are problems that can be solved by venture capital, startups, et cetera, and what are ones that largely exist outside of the specific means by which this vehicle can address problems. I bring this up because a friend of mine works in an influential House office, and he listens to this podcast. And he said, hey, can you get me a list of VCs that are investing in the defense industrial base? And my initial reaction is, well, that's not quite what's kind of happening here. So the reason why I bring this up, though, of course, is just that I think that we've kind of, in an effort to pitch funds, companies, et cetera, we've kind of confused what we are broadly trying to do here. So I'd like as much as you can your DIU Pentagon side to really delineate for people like what are the areas where we see VC working versus where's an area where it's like, look, primes, you need to get it together. Congress, you need to appropriate funds to increase production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Look, I think What are VCs meant to do? Venture capital, right? If you think about the capital ecosystem, they're there to take a lot of risk around technology. Like, can this actually be built? Will it work? We don't know. We have to go try. And we need somebody to back us and bet on us. And that's what venture capital is supposed to do and does really, really well. And they also take, they have to look at the market, right? So if we build this technology, is there enough market to make up for all the losers? Because it's really hard stuff. So what does that mean? If I think, again, low-cost hardware, I think about anything related to software. This is where venture world does really well. Now, if you're the government and you're the monopoly buyer, meaning like I'm the only buyer of a certain thing, aircraft carriers again. Well, there's only one buyer. There's only one, maybe one or two builders, and they have to work together. And it's a very different model. It can't fail. You're not taking, you're taking still risk, but it's a different type of risk, and it's not the technology risk that you're taking. So there's not a one size fits all. There's private capital available for that, but that's a whole nother world of private equity and then Wall Street that's going to react to the market. But this is what the government does know how to do well. Not to say that we've had a great success in that. I think we need more competition, and we're seeing hopefully more new primes being built. But yeah, again, it goes back to the beginning. It's not an either or. We need both.
We did the Kill Chain on this show, I think we've hit every single defense tech book published over the past few years. And what's funny about all of your guys' books start out by just referencing how clunky and old defense software is from the Pentagon, lots of Windows XP references, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At what point do you think we're going to just solve that issue? Do you kind of know what I mean? Like, that seems to be just sort of is there just a bill that someone needs to, because Hill staff listen to this. So someone just pass a bill saying we're going to transition to, let's say, Windows 11. How do you think through that? Because I'm just like, I just worry that I'll be doing this in 2033 and someone else will say, we're so close to getting off Windows Vista. We're in 2007 right now. Like, is this a problem we can just solve? You know what I mean? At a software level?
I hope so. I'm the eternal optimist in doing these things, and we need to again find ways to ingest some of this stuff and change it more quickly. And I think really it comes down to incentives. It's not a technology problem, right? Like, if I think about what would be the greatest force multiplier for the Department of Defense to improve our human talent, right? How do we make them more efficient? How do we recruit and retain more of them? You know what? I would fix the defense travel system, which is, how servicemen and women like book plane tickets and go places, right? But it's like Expedia from the 1980s. It's very clunky. I know some service people that spend 4 to 6 hours a week trying to file their travel vouchers, right? So it's really unsexy things. But if you think of that, multiply that by 3 million, like, that's a lot of people wasting a lot of time. And yet we have bespoke created software created by large defense primes. Like, this is travel. There are countless commercial solutions that could be adopted. But this is the kind of, change that's needed, but not easy to do.
And I think the awkward tension here is that in any public-facing enterprise, unless you have a true forcing function, it's hard to see unsexy change being made. Is that probably accurate when we're looking at these critiques of how outdated things feel? Like, for example, we have not lost wars necessarily, but we've lost lives over bad procurement or faulty tech. But it's never been that, like, man, if only our travel system was ready, we would have done better in 2004 in Anbar province, like, let's say. It seems to me that's like the critical differentiator here.
Absolutely. I mean, I would call it, wrapping yourself in the flag and combat things. Like, so for example, I'll share a quick story of how software development can work when it's a critical issue. So in 2016, I traveled to the Combined Air Operations Center. This is the big windowless building in Qatar that we run our air ops for Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. And I'm on a tour there with the Defense Innovation Board. And it doesn't look much different than when I was there a decade before in uniform. Like, maybe they have a newer version of Microsoft Excel, but everything's the same. we go to one section where they plan all the air refueling tankers, like which tanker goes where and which fighter is there to get gas at what time. It was being built on a large whiteboard with magnetic pucks and dry erase markers, and two guys on Excel doing math calculations and other people doing it. And we looked at this and we're like, man, if there's anything that some modern software could do, it's this. It's a traveling salesman problem. So I call this guy at DIUX, Colonel Enrique Odi, Air Force officer, who'd been wanting to reform how we do software. And I said, this is it. This is something very specific that we can go fix. So he recruits 3 Air Force engineers, 3 engineers from the Bay Area with long hair who would probably not pass the drug test. And we shipped them out to Qatar, got them 24-hour clearances. More importantly, we got them the first ever clearance to bring a Apple MacBook into the KOC. Until that point, right, they were not secure. You could only bring Windows machines. And we're like, well, no coder worth the salt codes on Windows XP. So General Harigian at the time made all these changes. So they go in. 6 weeks later, they built an automated system. You push a button and it calculates the tanker plan. Okay, it's not winning the war, but it's showing real change. Well, what we discovered was, so that tanker plan, the way they did it manually, took 60 man-hours a day to build. And you have to do it every 24 hours and you send it out to the bases. With this new system, you could do it immediately. Well, at the time, we had a lot of troops out there, and they would come into contact with the enemy, troops in contact situation. And the first thing you do is you send fighters over there to support them. Well, fighters are thirsty, so then you have to send tankers. But because the plan would take so long to build, you couldn't change it. So they had air refueling tankers on the ground waiting around the region. And this troops in contact would happen. You'd scramble one, guys would run to the jet, take off, and give them gas. Well, we discovered because once you could redo the plan, instead of scrambling tankers, you could just reflow it. And it was saving about 3 scrambles per day. Each scramble cost $250,000, not including all the wear and tear on the plane. And so the tool paid for itself in like 4 days. And I won't go into all the details, and you can see it in the book. But essentially, we said, great, this is successful. Let's do more of it. And there was an office in the Pentagon that said, or in the Air Force that said, this is really great. We're going to take it under advisement. We have a 10-year program to replace the old system. We're only 8 years into it. We're very close to releasing the first release. And, why don't you shut that down and, we'll do it the grown-up way. And General Harigian said, no, I'm using it in combat. So when you guys have a better system, you can bring it to me, but I'm not turning this thing off. And that led to a meeting with John McCain, with him canceling that program, and ultimately the development of the military's first software factory called Kessel Run, which is still running in Boston. Enrique, by the way, became the first commander of that. So again, it goes to your point. Do things that are combat related, demonstrate value, and change can happen.
The quick thing, not to take the thunder away from the story, which people should read in the book, but your telling of that story in the book featured one of the greatest government-centric, like passive-aggressive moves, which is they labeled it, I think it was a, quote, interesting demo. And the word demo, if you know anything about the military and the Pentagon specifically, like meant so much in comparison to the broader actual move there. So it's just so interesting how, and this is another thing, I'd love for you to talk about this, because this is just not just in this story, but across those first early years, everything seems so personal. Do you know what I mean? Like, this didn't come down to, oh, there was this very, very, very specific law that we required all of the weight of Congress to pass a new authorization. It was actually just sort of like, okay, so there's this one person who doesn't like Christopher, and he actually syncs with you a little better. Like, to what degree has the fact that the world is much more dangerous in the year 2024 than it did in 2014. Not that there wasn't dangerous, but the stakes have clearly raised. Has the interpersonal petty fiefdoms aspect been reduced at all? Or does it just transmogrify into a different form?
The Pentagon is the world's largest organization. It has 3 million people in uniform, civilians, etc. And I think, like all organizations, within, they're made of people. And ultimately, this is a human endeavor to build things, change things. And it's not that they're bad people necessarily, though there's a few, but most of them are not. Most people are trying to do the right thing. It's just they don't have the right trust. They don't have the right exposure. And so I think to what makes people really effective in large organizations, they know how to work with others. They know how to get them to follow them and excite them and believe they're going to do it the right way. So I think that's just a natural condition. And there's never some just random dark law or rule. There's usually people involved that you have to spend time with to help them understand why this different way will achieve what we all want.
So for this last section or two, we could transition into the what do we need to actually do part. So if you're thinking as a policymaker, you are focused on Eastern Europe, you're focused on the Indo-Pacific, and you're focused in different ways on the Middle East, Israel, and then, of course, Yemen. How do you think through the ways that the practices and innovations that the DIU and other institutions work on can offer solutions to, or not even solutions, that word isn't always accurate, but can help address concerns or problem sets that folks have?
I think we're getting a view into the war of the future. Right? We talked a little bit about the Ukraine and the tanks. When Hamas led the attacks on the 7th, the first thing they did was send drones, drop grenades on the power stations that powered all the Israeli defenses. If you look at what the Houthis are doing with the drones and our ships, I think we're doing a great job, but shooting a $15,000 drone with a $3 million missile doesn't scale well. So we're seeing a glimpse of that. There's a cost element to it in addition to speed. And I think, are we learning the right lessons? I think we are learning them. I think there's a lot been written about it. So then let's go to the harder part of how are we reacting to that lesson, right? It's one thing, as you said, demo, right? It's easy to get demo. Here's some interesting technology. Let's try it. Let's test it. Wonderful. And DIU and others do a good job of that. The bigger question is, if we want to do a lot of something, what are we then not going to do? And that becomes hard. What are you going to give up? What capability? What, the Air Force measures itself historically in the number of fighter wings. The Army measures itself in the number of battalions. The Navy has measured itself in the number of ships. Okay, so are we going to do less of one of those three? And if so, how do we get that through? So I think, I think that's looking forward. What I want to see is that, hey, is budget meeting strategy? Because if you listen to the senior leaders in the Pentagon, it's very clear they understand this trend that's coming. They're talking about it. You hear about it on the Hill. But as some great leaders have said, budget is strategy. So how are we going to make those hard choices?
If there's something that the 1990s and beyond Silicon Valley is specialized in, it's been reducing cost, right? Like software is cheaper, digital is cheaper than the analog world that it replaces. We're in this awkward position where on the one hand, folks recognize defense budgets need to meet the nature of the challenges we face, but there's also a big conversation in Washington about like the budget overall. To what degree do you think SV, defense tech in general, could help address the broader budget crisis issue within the DoD specifically?
Look, I argue both. I mean, historically, we are now at the lowest spend on defense GDP in history. And that's also true for our allies. It's a very dangerous world. I think the conflict between authoritarianism and liberal Western democracy is the greatest challenge of our lifetime. And you're seeing adventurism. So we feel like we need more national security spend. From a budget standpoint, 75% of the U.S.'s annual spend goes to entitlements and paying debt, interest payments on the debt. So discretionary spending is only 25% right now. So I think there's some broad budgetary realities that we need to face as a nation to make sure we're spending our hard-earned tax dollars on the right things. So I think there's that top line. There's also the allocation within the budget. I mean, it's still an $800 billion budget. It's not chump change. And so how do we spend that? And then I think to your point where, historically better capability cost more, right? You spend more money on a bigger satellite, a more advanced jet, it's probably better. It may not always be true, right? In this new paradigm where speed and mass. So if I have 10,000 drones that are maybe not that smart, and maybe a couple hundred of them don't even get it off the runway because they crash, is that okay? Because they were cheaper and I got more of them and I got them 6 months faster? I don't know the answer, but those are the debates we need to have.
And second to last, what is your reflection on the state of defense tech investing in general? This is an interesting category because I think it's colloquially easy to say, oh, it's fashionable. Oh, it could be the next bubble. But I think unlike other aspects of, let's say, tech markets or tech bubbles, this I think is just deeply, deeply critical. So I don't want it to be a bubble on a couple different levels. What's just like your reflection on the state of the industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, I think it's important that we don't have a bubble. It's still very hard to build and sell, get traction with the government customer. So, we want to make sure there's some winners. We want more capital instead of, the other big difference between the monopsony buying process and this commercial one is that the taxpayer isn't footing the bill for all the R&D. Like these are private venture dollars going into them. And so we want that to keep flowing. And so if it does feel sometimes a little bubblish, that's a concern. The other point is, how do we continue to leverage the commercial consumer or customer market, both enterprise, where the government's not the only customer, particularly for software.
And here's the final question, which I surprisingly have not heard anyone ask on your previous podcast appearances. I'd like you to close by reflecting on the human factor when it comes to all this, because critically, you were an F-16C pilot. You are an F-16 pilot in the Air National Guard. And we're conventionally talking about these terms colloquially, focusing on, is the era of the fighter, is it still with us? Are you going to have different iterations of AI filling different roles? You have one of the most human jobs within this weird technological paradigm we're in. How do you think through on a personal level what this moment feels like?
So there was a Deputy Secretary of Defense. His name was Bob Work. He was the Deputy Secretary for Ash Carter and was a great champion of DIU and other things. And he would say that the Pentagon doesn't have an innovation problem, but an innovation adoption problem. So if you go out to the field, be it a fighter squadron, a group of Marine infantrymen, sailors on a ship, you'll meet the most innovative people in the world. They're given a difficult mission that is literally life or death. And it's a no-fail mission. And they will do it to their best of the ability, no matter what gear you have. And they'll be inventive and they'll do workarounds and they'll try it. And so the question is, for me, is, are we taking enough risk in startup land? Are we taking enough risk in the cubicles in the Pentagon where like a paper cut's your worst risk, right? We should take the risk here and not on the battlefield. Because at the end of the day, even when you have drones, there's still men and women in harm's way. And, if we get it wrong or we don't do everything we can do, I think, less Americans and our allies and innocent civilians come home alive. So it's really, really important to get it right.
That is an excellent place to leave the conversation. Raj, thank you for joining. The book is Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War, out now.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.